The paddle went up slowly, like a man lifting something heavy, like a man who had thought about it a long time before he moved. And when it rose, when that cracked, sun-darkened hand lifted that little orange bidding paddle into the gray October sky of Boone County, Iowa, the laughter started almost immediately. Not polite laughter, not the kind men do when they're embarrassed for someone. No, this was the full-throated, stomach-shaking laughter of a crowd that had already made up its mind about a man before he ever opened his mouth. The auctioneer, a sharp-jawed fellow named Dale Hutton who'd been running farm sales in central Iowa since 1971, paused mid-sentence. He looked at the paddle, he looked at the man holding it, and for just a half-second, even Dale went quiet. Then the laughter got louder. But I need you to hold on to this moment, because in about 22 minutes of real time, in the span it takes to drink a cup of coffee, that same crowd would stand in absolute silence, and the man they laughed at would walk to his truck without saying a single word. That's what this story is about. Let me take you somewhere. October 14th, 1987, Boone County, Iowa, 14 miles northwest of the town of Ogden, on a gravel road so straight it looks like God drew it with a ruler across a tabletop of corn stubble. The sky that morning was the color of old pewter, low clouds dragging themselves eastward, the kind of sky that doesn't threaten rain so much as it promises it eventually. The temperature sat at 41 degrees by 8 in the morning, and by 10 it hadn't moved more than a degree in either direction. Men standing in the yard of the Keller farm turned their jacket collars up and tucked their hands into their armpits between bids. The smell of that morning was particular. If you've ever stood in a farmyard in October in Iowa, you know it, that cold, iron smell of turned earth, the faint sweetness of rotting corn husks, diesel exhaust from a dozen trucks idling along the fence line, and underneath all of it, something older and sadder, the smell of a farm being taken apart. Because that's what a farm auction is at its heart. It is a family's entire working life spread out across a yard for strangers to pick through and carry home. Every tool, every implement, every machine that a man spent 40 years choosing, repairing, and depending on, all of it tagged with a number, all of it reduced to a dollar amount. Harold Keller had farmed this land since 1952. He'd raised 4 children here, buried a wife here, paid off a mortgage, and then, in the brutal years of the early 1980s farm crisis, taken on a second one to survive. By 1986, the interest alone was killing him. By the spring of 1987, the bank in Ogden had made its decision. Harold wasn't at the auction that morning. His daughter said he drove to a cousin's place in Ames the night before and didn't come back until it was over. You can't blame a man for that. There were perhaps 200 people in that yard. Farmers, dealers, neighbors, curiosity seekers, and the particular breed of man who circles farm auctions the way a crow circles roadkill, patient, calculating, never in a hurry. Among them, almost invisible, stood Earl Haddon. Let me tell you about Earl Haddon. Earl was 68 years old that October morning, though he looked older to people who didn't know him and younger to people who did. He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, which doesn't sound small until you've seen him standing next to the machinery he worked with, those great green and red iron giants that made even tall men look ordinary. He weighed maybe 155 pounds in his winter coat. His hands were the color of the earth and about the same texture. His face had been arranged by decades of sun and cold and squinting into the wind into something that suggested great patience and very little nonsense. Earl farmed 160 acres of rented ground in the western part of Boone County, ground he'd been renting from the Meisenheimer family since 1964. He had never owned his land outright. He had never driven a new tractor off a dealer's lot. He had never, not once in 43 years of farming, bought anything he couldn't mostly fix himself when it broke. His neighbors respected him the way you respect a stone wall, quietly, without making a fuss about it, and mostly because it's been there a long time without falling down. Earl had grown up in the Depression, which meant he had grown up learning that the difference between a useful machine and a useless one had very little to do with the year it was built, and almost everything to do with the man who understood it. His father had taught him to fix a John Deere Model D with field-fabricated parts when they couldn't afford the real ones. His uncle had taught him the internal geometry of an Allis-Chalmers WD-45 so thoroughly that Earl could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, The way a doctor puts a stethoscope to a chest and hears things that aren't in any textbook. Earl drove to the Keller farm that morning in a 1971 Ford F-100 pickup with 212,000 miles on the odometer and a crack in the passenger side windshield that he'd sealed with a bead of silicone caulk in 1984 and never gotten around to replacing. He parked at the back of the field, away from the crowd. He ate a biscuit his wife Lorraine had wrapped in wax paper, and then he walked quietly down the fence line to look at what Harold Keller was selling. He wasn't there for most of it. He was there for one thing. Now let me introduce you to a different kind of man. Dennis Farwell was 39 years old in the fall of 1987, which in the culture of Boone County, Iowa farm auctions made him practically a teenager compared to most of the men bidding. But Dennis didn't feel like a teenager. Dennis felt and carried himself like a man who had already won. He'd grown up in Des Moines, the son of a machinery dealer, and he had come into the family business with an MBA from the University of Iowa and a talent for knowing exactly what the market would bear. By 1987, Farwell Agricultural Equipment had 3 locations in central Iowa, Ogden, Jefferson, and Ames, and Dennis was in the process of opening a 4th in Boone. He drove a 1986 Chevrolet Silverado, silver with a dealer plate. He wore a Carhartt jacket that had never seen a full day's work. His boots were Red Wings, resoled once and still looking store-bought. Dennis was not a bad man, exactly. But he was a man who had confused knowing the price of things with understanding their value, and he had been making that mistake long enough that it had become invisible to him. At farm auctions, Dennis worked a particular angle. He would let the crowd thin the ordinary equipment, the hay rakes and post-hole diggers and grain carts, and then he would step in for the large iron, tractors, combines, the kind of machines where the numbers got serious. He had a reputation for buying clean, and he had a reputation for walking away from anything that wasn't. He talked loudly about horsepower ratings and hydraulic specifications and resale margins, and the younger men around him nodded and deferred because he spoke with the authority of a man who had never been wrong in front of them. When the auctioneer started working his way toward the back corner of Harold Keller's machine shed, Dennis Farwell moved to the front of the crowd. He brought 2 of his employees with him, young men named Cody and Travis, who worked his Ogden lot and who had learned to stand slightly behind Dennis and slightly to either side, the way adjutants stand near a general. In the back corner of that machine shed, under a tarp dark with old grease and hay dust, sat the one thing Earl Hutton had driven 14 miles of gravel road to see. And when Dale Hutton's assistant pulled that tarp off, Dennis Farwell laughed first. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When is the last time you dismissed something or someone because of how they looked on the outside, before you knew what was underneath? Keep that thought. Keep it close for the next few minutes. What Dale Hutton's assistant revealed when he pulled that tarp was a 1952 Allis-Chalmers WD-45 tractor, or what remained of one. To the untrained eye, and Dennis Farwell had trained his eyes on spreadsheets rather than machines, it was a ruin. The Persian orange paint, that distinctive Allis-Chalmers color, warm as a harvest moon, had faded and flaked to the color of old brick. The front left wheel had been replaced at some point with a wheel from a different machine, slightly smaller, giving the tractor a faint list. The hood was dented on the right side, a long crease that looked like it had met a gate post in anger sometime in the 1970s. The seat was a replacement, a generic black vinyl bolt-on that had never been original to the machine. One rear fender was missing entirely. And it had been sitting, Harold Keller's daughter would later explain, in the back of that shed for 11 years. Harold's hip had gone bad in 1976, and the WD-45 had been too low to the ground for him to climb into and out of comfortably. He'd moved to a newer Massey Ferguson in 1977, and the old Allis had just stayed and waited, the way old machines do. Dennis Farwell looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. "What are they going to ask for that?" he said, to nobody in particular but loudly enough to be heard. $20 and a prayer." The men around him laughed. Travis and Cody laughed. A few farmers who didn't know any better laughed. Even Dale Hutton smiled a little, the smile of a man who's seen a lot of old iron and has learned to manage expectations. "She's seen better days," Dale said diplomatically into his microphone, because Dale was a professional, "but we'll start her where she deserves and let you gentlemen decide." She's seen better decades, Dennis said, and there was more laughter, and he turned to a man next to him and said something quietly, and that man laughed too, and Dennis looked around the crowd with the satisfied expression of a man who has just been confirmed in his judgment. That was when Earl Haddon stepped forward from the back of the group. He moved slowly, the way men move when they are not trying to draw attention but also no longer willing to stay where they are. He worked his way through the crowd, excuse me, pardon me, until he was perhaps 6 feet from the tractor. He stood there with his hands in the pockets of his canvas coat, and he looked at the machine with an expression that was difficult to read. Not nostalgia exactly, more the way a doctor looks at a patient, not with feeling but with assessment. He circled it once. He crouched down on one side and looked under the belly of it. He straightened up, pulled off one work glove, and laid his bare palm against the engine block the way you'd test the temperature of something. Dennis watched him. "You thinking about bidding on that, old-timer?" Dennis said, not cruel exactly, the way a man says something when he's confident enough not to need to be cruel. Earl didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the carburetor. "I might be," Earl said. "Well," Dennis smiled, "don't let me stop you." More laughter, softer this time. Some of the older men in the crowd had stopped laughing and were just watching. "What's she worth to you?" Dennis said, "if you don't mind my asking." Earl looked up. He had pale gray eyes, the kind that seem clearer in cold weather. "Probably more than she looks," Earl said, and that was all he said. Dale Hutton cleared his throat into the microphone. "All right, gentlemen," Dale said, "let's start this old girl at $500 and see where she takes us." And Dennis Farwell, absolutely certain, completely confident, smiled and shook his head like a man watching someone else make a mistake. Let me tell you what Earl Haddon knew. Earl had owned a WD-45 himself, not this one, but a 1954 model, bought used in 1961 for $400 from a retiring farmer in Webster County. He had farmed with that tractor for 19 years, until a fire in his machine shed in 1980 took it along with most of his small equipment. He had cried about that tractor briefly and in private, the way a man cries about the loss of something that worked faithfully and asked nothing in return. In those 19 years, Earl had learned the WD-45 the way musicians learn their instruments, not from a manual but from listening, from feeling, from the 10,000 small adjustments and repairs that accumulate into something that isn't knowledge so much as relationship. The WD-45, built by Alice Chalmers in the years between 1953 and 1957, with the 1952 models being what the company called late production WDs transitioning to the WD-45 specification, was in Earl's considered judgment one of the finest agricultural engines of the mid-century period. The 226 cubic inch 4-cylinder power plant, properly maintained, was not just capable, it was practically indestructible. It ran cool, it ran clean, and it had a harmonic balance that most of the engines that came after it never quite matched. But here is what made Earl Haddon different from every other man standing in that yard, including Dennis Farwell. Earl had looked under the belly of that tractor for one specific reason. He was looking for evidence of whether the engine block had been cracked by a winter freeze, the single most common killer of machines that sit unheated in Midwestern sheds for years. A cracked block meant a parts machine, nothing more. The block was not cracked. Earl could tell because he knew where to look, and because he had run his hand across the metal and felt what he expected to feel. Solid iron, no hairline, no moisture shadow. He had also looked at the fuel bowl, which was dry but clean, not varnished, not corroded. Someone at some point not too long ago had drained this machine properly before storing it. Harold Keller, in his methodical, old country way, had done the thing right. Earl had looked at the rear axle seals dry. He had looked at the magneto housing intact. He had looked at the drawbar, original, unstressed, no fatigue cracking. And then he had looked at one more thing. Stamped on a small plate behind the instrument panel, partially obscured by dried mud, were 7 characters that Earl had to lean close to read. He had to look twice. Then he had put his glove back on and stood quietly in the cold for a moment. Because what Earl Haddon had just discovered, and what Dennis Farwell, with all his spreadsheets and market knowledge, had never bothered to check, was that this particular WD-45 was fitted with a factory-original snap coupler hitch system. And more significantly, a rare factory-installed dual-range transmission, upgrade that Allis-Chalmers had offered as an option on fewer than 400 units in the 1952 model year. Now that might sound like machinery talk, and it is, but here is why it mattered in October of 1987. There was a collector's market, small, serious, and extremely well-funded, that had been growing throughout the 1980s for original specification antique farm tractors. The Antique Power magazine had been running since 1985. The national shows at Waukee and Grundy Center drew buyers from 8 states. And a factory-original WD-45 with documented dual-range transmission, one of fewer than 400 ever built, in a condition that could be returned to running with mechanical work alone, no new castings, no rebuilds. That machine was worth, in the collector's market of 1987, somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000. Not $500. Not the joke that Dennis Farwell had been making. Earl Hutton did not share any of this information with anyone standing in that yard. He simply walked back to his place in the crowd. And he waited. Now I want you to picture this yard again. 200 people, cold morning, the smell of diesel and October earth. Dale Hutton standing on the running board of his truck with his microphone, his voice carrying that auctioneer's particular rhythm, not quite singing, not quite speaking, something in between that has its own momentum, its own music. $500 to start this fine old Allis, who'll give me 500. Do I hear 500 for the WD fine piece of American iron, who'll start us at 5? Silence. Nobody moved. Dale dropped to 400, nobody. Dale, who had done this for 16 years, understood the crowd. He went to 250. A man in the back, a scrapper from Ames named Bud Linhart, who bought old iron by the pound, raised his hand. 250, I have 250, who'll give me $300 for this WD-45. Dennis Farwell, standing near the front, raised his hand in a slow, bored way. Not because he wanted the tractor. He was bidding the way rich men sometimes bid at auctions, to be seen participating, to confirm his presence in the yard. He bid $300 on a machine he intended to put on his Boone lot as a decorative piece, maybe stripped for parts. 300 to the gentleman up front, 300, who'll give me 350. The man from Ames shook his head. He was a scrapper, he knew scrap metal prices. 300 already exceeded his math. 300 going once. And that is when Earl Hutton raised his orange paddle. Slow, deliberate, the way I described to you at the very beginning. And the laughter started. Because the crowd had seen Earl circling the machine, and the crowd had drawn its conclusions about Earl, and the crowd, in the way of crowds, was certain. Well, look at that, Dennis said. He said it quietly, but the men around him heard it and they laughed, and the laughter spread the way laughter does when it has a target. We have 350, Dale said professionally without expression. Dennis raised his hand, 400. Earl raised his paddle, 450. The laughter hadn't fully died. There were still chuckles at the edges of the crowd, men nudging each other, the shared knowledge of a joke being told in slow motion. Dennis looked over at Earl with an expression that was almost amused, a man who is tolerating the intrusion of something beneath him. 500, Dennis. 550, Earl. Here is where the first silence started, not the full silence, not yet, but a quieting at the edges of the crowd, because Earl Hutton had not hesitated. He raised his paddle immediately, without the pause that buyers make when they're approaching their limit. He raised it the way a man raises his hand when he already knows what he's going to say. 600, Dennis, still smiling, still certain. 650, Earl. He's serious, someone said quietly to no one. 700, Dennis raised his paddle faster now, a flicker of something behind the confidence, not concern but awareness. He looked at Earl. Earl was looking at the tractor. 750, Earl. What is he doing? Travis said to Cody, not quietly enough. 800, Dennis. 850, Earl. The chuckling had stopped entirely. The yard had the quality of air before a storm, that pressurized stillness when weather decides what it's going to do. 900, Dennis. 950. Earl Haddon raised his paddle, and his hand was absolutely steady. Dennis Farwell paused for the first time in the morning, for possibly the first time in years. Dennis Farwell paused before bidding at a farm auction. He looked at the tractor. He looked at Earl. He looked at the tractor again. And whatever was in that pause, whatever calculation or doubt moved through him in those 3 seconds, it wasn't enough. 1,000, Dennis. $1,000 bid, Dale Hutton said, and you could hear in his voice that he too had noticed something. Do I hear 1,100? 1,100, Earl. 1,200, Dennis. 1,300, Earl. $1,300, Dale said, and his voice had slowed to match the gravity of what was happening. For the WD-45, 1,300 bid. Dennis looked at Earl for a long moment. Earl was looking at the tractor. 14, Dennis said. 1,400. And Earl Haddon turned and looked at Dennis Farwell for just a moment, and Earl raised his paddle again. 1,500, Dale said. $1,500 for the 1952 Allis-Chalmers WD-45. Do I hear 16? The crowd was perfectly quiet now. Dennis raised his hand. 16. Earl 17. Dennis 18. And here is the moment. Here is the exact moment that men who were there would describe years later in coffee shops and at their own families' dinner tables as the one thing they never forgot about that October morning. Earl Haddon lowered his paddle. He looked at Dennis Farwell. And he raised his paddle again and said clearly, out loud, so the whole yard could hear. 2,000. He didn't wait for Dale to carry the bid. He named the number himself. He said it flat and even, the way you say something that isn't a guess. Absolute silence. Dennis Farwell's jaw tightened. He looked at the tractor. The old, faded, dented, one fender missing, wrong front wheel, 11-year sitting Allis-Chalmers WD-45. He tried to think of why a man in a cracked windshield truck was willing to pay $2,000 for it. He couldn't think of why. And because he couldn't think of why, and because he was a man who had built his confidence on knowing prices, and this price no longer made sense to him, Dennis Farwell did not raise his paddle. $2,000, Dale Hutton said. His voice had dropped to something close to reverent. Going once, going twice. He paused. Sold to the gentleman in the canvas coat. What happened next was nothing. That sounds simple, but it wasn't. The nothing that happened was a particular kind of nothing, the nothing of 200 people who have been laughing and are no longer laughing and are not quite sure what to do with the space where the laughter used to be. Earl hadn't put his paddle down under his arm. He walked to the auction table and filled out the bid card. He wrote a personal check slowly and carefully, the way a man writes a check for an amount that matters. He tore it out and handed it to Dale Hutton's assistant, a young woman named Karen who had worked farm sales for 3 seasons, and who would later say that she had never seen a man write a check so calmly for an amount that had surprised everyone else in the yard. Dennis Farwell stood where he had been standing. Travis and Cody stood slightly behind him. Nobody said anything. Dennis looked at the tractor once more, and then he looked at the ground, and then he put his hands in his Carhartt pockets and walked toward the other machines, and the crowd parted for him in the automatic way that crowds part for people who need a moment. An older farmer named Glenn Shutt, who had farmed in the county since 1955, and who had watched the whole thing from the fence line with the patience of a man who'd seen enough auctions to know what he was watching, pulled the brim of his seed corn cap down and said to the man next to him, he knew something. That was the whole analysis, 3 words. Nobody went to ask Earl Haddon what he knew. He had already walked back to his truck, the one with the cracked windshield and the 212,000 miles, and he was sitting in it with the engine running, eating the second half of the biscuit Lorraine had packed for him. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look like a man who'd won anything. He looked like a man who had done what he came to do and was ready to go home for lunch. The auction continued. A 1979 John Deere 4440 went for $14,000. A grain drill went for $850. Life resumed its ordinary pace. But something had shifted in that yard. You could feel it, the way you feel a temperature change. The air was the same temperature, but it felt different. The WD-45 sat in the corner of Harold Keller's machine shed, still and patient, the way it had sat for 11 years, waiting for someone who understood it. Now let me tell you what happened next, and I want you to listen to this part carefully, because this is where the story stops being about an auction and starts being about something larger. Earl hadn't arranged for the WD-45 to be flatbedded to his farm the following week. He spent the winter of 1987 and into the spring of 1988 doing what he had known from the moment he read that identification plate would be possible: a full mechanical restoration requiring no new castings, no engine rebuild, and no specialty fabrication. He sourced a correct-tier fender from a retired collector in Dallas Center. He had a friend in Marshalltown match and apply the Allis-Chalmers Persian orange paint to factory specification. He cleaned the dual-range transmission, found it functionally sound, and documented its originality with photographs and the serial number correspondence he cross-referenced from a 1953 Allis-Chalmers dealer catalog he'd ordered through an agricultural library in Ames. He spent approximately $600 in parts and materials. In June of 1988, Earl Hutton took the restored WD-45 to the Iowa Antique Tractor and Engine Show at Waukee. He had corresponded over the winter months with a collector named Robert Fenimore of Springfield, Missouri, a retired engineer who had been assembling a documented collection of low-production Allis-Chalmers variants for 11 years. Robert Fenimore looked at the tractor for about 40 minutes. He asked Earl a series of technical questions. Earl answered them all correctly and without consulting notes. Robert Fenimore wrote Earl Hutton a check for $5,400. Earl drove home to Lorraine. He told her the check was on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a long moment. "What are we going to do with it?" she said. "Pay ahead on the rent," Earl said, "and fix the windshield." He fixed the windshield. Now, I want to tell you something about Dennis Farwell, because this is not a story about a villain who suffers a cartoonish comeuppance. Dennis was a smart man who had made a specific kind of mistake, and smart men, if they're honest with themselves, learn from specific mistakes. Sometime in the spring of 1988, Dennis began attending the Iowa State University Extension Service workshops on antique machinery markets. He began reading Antique Power magazine. He began, slowly and with some difficulty, relearning how to look at old machines, not for their current condition, but for what they had been and what they could become. By 1991, Farwell Agricultural Equipment had added an antique and vintage tractor division to their Ogden location. It was a modest but profitable operation. Dennis would say later to his brother-in-law over beers at a 4th of July cookout in Ames that the whole idea came from watching an old man in a canvas coat at a farm auction. He didn't know the old man's name. He'd never asked. Earl Hutton continued farming his 160 rented acres through 1993, when his knees finally insisted on retirement. He and Lorraine moved to a smaller place in Ogden. He kept a shop in the back of the property, and he kept attending farm auctions, not often but occasionally when something drew his attention. He never again bid as dramatically as he had that October morning, but those who knew him said that he always bid exactly what a thing was worth to him, and that his sense of what things were worth had an unsettling accuracy that never really diminished with age. Harold Keller, whose farm had been the occasion for all of this, Harold came back from Ames the day after the auction and walked through the empty machine shed alone. His daughter drove him out there. She said he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I hope she went to somebody who'll appreciate her." He meant the Allis-Chalmers. Harold Keller died in 1994 at the age of 79 in a care facility in Boone. His obituary noted 42 years of farming in Boone County, 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and a lifelong membership in the First Lutheran Church of Ogden. It did not mention the WD-45. Obituaries rarely mention the machines. But the machines were always there. Behind every number in the yield reports, every bag of seed, every furrow drawn in the dark Iowa soil, the machines were always there. Let me pause here and ask you something. What did Earl Hutton have that Dennis Farwell didn't? You might say knowledge, and you'd be right, but that's the surface of it. Dennis Farwell knew plenty of things. He knew horsepower ratings and market comparables and resale margins. He knew how to read a balance sheet. He knew which auctions to attend and which to skip. He He was, by any reasonable business measure, more knowledgeable about the agricultural equipment market than Earl Hutton was. What Earl had was different. Earl had paid attention. For 40 years, he had been present with his machines in a way that went beyond use. He had listened to them, learned their particular sounds and resistances and tendencies. He had sat in the cold of his shed on winter afternoons with his hand on the block of a dead engine, thinking, not studying, thinking. There is a difference. Studying is looking at things from the outside. Thinking is getting inside them. He had also, and this is the part I want you to hold on to, he had also never let the appearance of a thing determine his assessment of its value. Not once. Not the cracked paint, not the wrong wheel, not the missing fender, not the 11 years of dust. He had looked past all of that because he had been trained by a life of honest work to look past all of that. The world we live in has become extraordinarily good at surfaces. We are sophisticated readers of exteriors, of brands, of appearances, of signals. We make our judgments quickly, and we are often right enough that the habit gets reinforced. But what we pay for that efficiency is a blindness to certain kinds of value. The value that doesn't advertise itself. The value that requires you to slow down, get your hands dirty, and actually look. Earl Hutton wasn't special because he was smarter than Dennis Farwell. He was special because he had never stopped believing that the work of knowing a thing was worth doing. The old farmers knew this. They had to. They could not afford to dismiss anything. A tool that worked was a tool that worked, regardless of its age or its paint job or whether a 20-year-old salesman thought it was worth laughing at. There is a generation of American farmers, men and women who came up in the Depression and the war years and the difficult decades that followed, who carried with them a profound and practical wisdom about the relationship between patience and value, who understood that the measure of a thing is not what it looks like on the worst day of its life, but what it is capable of in the hands of someone who understands it. We are losing that generation. We have been losing them one at a time since before I started telling these stories. And when they go, they take with them something that cannot be downloaded or Googled or learned in a weekend course, a sensibility, a way of moving through the world that was earned through decades of getting it wrong and getting it right in the cold and the heat and the dark of early mornings. Earl Hutton is gone now. He passed in February of 2001 at the age of 81 in Ogden, Iowa. He farmed until he couldn't, fixed things until his hands wouldn't cooperate, and spent his last years in that little shop in the back of his property doing what he'd always done, taking things apart to understand them, and putting them back together better than they were before. Lorraine says he talked about the WD-45 sometimes, not proudly, exactly, the way you talk about something that confirmed what you already knew. She was a good machine, he used to say. She just needed somebody to remember that. She just needed somebody to remember that. I think about that line a lot. I think about all the things in this world, all the people, all the ideas, all the old ways of doing things that are sitting in the corner of some shed, under a dusty tarp in a form that makes the crowd laugh. I think about how much is still worth something, still capable of something, still fundamentally sound, waiting for the one person who will slow down long enough to lay a bare hand on the block and feel what's really there. Don't be the person who laughs and walks away. Be the person who looks twice. That's the story of Earl Hutton and the paddle that went up slow and the morning in Boone County, Iowa, when 200 people learned what it costs to mistake a quiet man for a foolish one. Thank you for watching The Forgotten Farmer. If this story moved you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. These stories deserve to be heard. Historical context is real. The 1987 Iowa farm crisis, Allis-Chalmers WD-45 production specifications, the Iowa Antique Tractor and Engine Show, and Boone County geography are all accurate. Earl Hutton, Dennis Farwell, Harold Keller, Dale Hutton, and all associated characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes. The Forgotten Farmer. Telling the story's history left in the field.